Just a brief commercial. Next month, I'm going to be talking about Mineral Hill, a site in Carroll County, which was a copper mining site from before the American Revolution and sporadically into the early 20th century. So it's an industrial site. And then in March, the last scheduled lecture, talking about pig manure and swizzle sticks. And if you want to know what that's about, you'll just have to tune in. So, this is a site that has a bit of an identity problem, mostly because of me. It's in Calvert County. We've been calling it the Roberts site. And we've been calling it the Roberts site because the person who owned the property at the time we did the archaeology, his last name was Roberts. And that's a pretty conventional approach. For this evening, we can call it the Skinner Plantation. Okay, so we're in Calvert County, pretty much the middle of Calvert County. You can see the blue star here. We're right in Prince Frederick. And if you know the Prince Frederick area, well, Route 24, that's the road that goes through Calvert County. We've got Prince Frederick is in the center of the screen. That's Route 2 running through. And this road running up this way to the east is Dares Beach Road. It's a major intersection here. This is an old map, an old topographic map, so it's changed quite a lot. The Armory, actually this school here isn't here anymore, it's been bulldozed. Over in this area is the Armory, and the site we're talking about is just up a hill, or was just up a hill above the Armory. Now, the reason we were working on this site was because years ago, in fact, we worked on this in 2004, if memory serves. Calvert County wanted to build essentially a beltway around Prince Frederick to alleviate the traffic. And so you can tell this is an old map because they've in fact built much of that beltway and none of it appears on the map. In the course of designing this road, the county and state of Maryland needed an archaeological survey. And so they had, it was Greenhorn O'Mare, an engineering firm that did the archaeological survey. And where that circle is, they found some artifacts that suggested an 18th century site. So when we got out there in 2003, 2004, this is what that site looked like. Open lawn, used to be cultivated fields. Notice the slope. One of the important points I want to make this evening is about that slope. It's about erosion, and it's about the loss of a good part of this archaeological site. And it's a situation that persists across the entire state, where because of poor land use practices, poor agricultural practices, we've lost a tremendous amount of archaeological data. So we looked at, who owned this land. Site was found, it looks like it's 18th century. What tract of land are we talking about? And there are a whole series of patented tracts of land. These are lands that people went to Lord Baltimore and said, I want 100 acres here, I want 200 acres there. I'd like to get it surveyed, and I would like to possess that land. Now, Lord Baltimore, the various Lord Baltimores, didn't sell people the land. It was a rental, it was a lease with no time limit. So you acquired a piece of land and you did whatever you were going to do with it, but you paid Lord Baltimore rent twice a year, and you also swore an oath of fealty to Lord Baltimore, which among other things included your statement as a patentee that you understood that Lord Baltimore owned the land, you did not, and he had the right to own that land. Beginning in the 1750s, the last Lord Baltimore started selling land in fee simple the way we do today. But until the 1750s, there was only one landowner in Maryland, and that was Lord Baltimore. We think this particular parcel is parts of Borders Enlarged, Newington Reserve. It's a little we're a little hazy as to what tract of land this was because Calvert County records are in somewhat of a disarray. The county courthouse burned twice, I think in the 1880s. So a lot of records have been lost. So it's very difficult to do historical research in the county, much more difficult than it is in, say, Charles County or St. Mary's. This is an image, this is a reconstruction of those tracts of land. And it's not tied into current maps, so it looks like just an abstract design. But those two tracts with the heavy borders are the ones on which the Skinner's Plantation, the Roberts site, appears to be. One of these days, we'll continue adding to these boundaries reconstructed from surveyors' notes from the 17th and 18th centuries, and we'll actually be able to pin it down on the land on a current map. So here's the site, and there are a lot of lines through there, so I'll explain them. A lot of the lines, especially those to the left, are topographic lines. These are contours, so you can see there's quite a slope going down to the west or to the left-hand side of the screen, including a drainage near the, where the scale bar is. There's a fairly deep drainage running through here. So that's all a product of erosion. The curved lines that run from the top of the screen, center, down towards the lower right, those are the boundaries of what the county wanted to build as part of this new road, this beltway, if you will. The circles that with a number, those are shovel test pits we've dug, and those of you who've tuned in to these talks before should have a pretty good idea of what a shovel test pit is by now. You know, little round holes, about a foot, foot and a half in diameter, going down 1 to 3 feet, screen the soil, collect the artifacts, try to get some sense of where the site might be. But with these shovel test pits dug at, looks like 50-foot intervals, only 2 shovel test pits actually produced any cultural material. And don't ask me offhand what they are, I don't remember. But numbers 2 and 13 both produced some sort of artifact, probably an 18th century artifact. That's not very much. In fact, in a lot of surveys, if that's what we came up with, a lot of sites like that would simply be blown off. We'd say, well, there's nothing there. It's field scatter. But when we went back in, and this is probably obscured by all our faces, but on the right-hand side of the screen, we went back and did a lot more shovel test pits at 25-foot intervals. And the darkened circles represent those units that produced cultural material, a list of which appears on the left-hand side, at least the, yeah, I think that's most of what we found. So not a lot of stuff, a total of 11 artifacts from what, 6 or 7 shovel test pits. But redware, tin glazed earthenware, British brown stoneware, Westerwald, white salt glaze, these are classic 18th century ceramics. And they're by and large predate the American Revolution. If we were finding creamware and pearlware, that would suggest late 18th century, Revolutionary War and onward. But just based on these shovel test pits, it looks like we have a pre-Revolutionary War site. We went back and dug excavation units, and these are a little hard to find. So we dug 5 excavation units, each of them 5 feet on a side. And what we hit was a lot of eroded soils. It was clear, pretty clear from this stage of the game that this site was heavily eroded. So a lot of what was there had washed down the hill. But you can see unit 5 over here, 1, 2, 3, 4 is up here, and then a small 2.5 by 2.5 foot unit up here. And what you see on the left-hand side of the artifacts we recovered, looks like 93, total of 93 artifacts from 5 large units and 1 small unit. That's not very much stuff. And a lot of these are really tiny pieces too. But they tell us that there's clearly an archaeological site there. And judging from the kind, we did find 3 pieces of creamware. So we've got something that maybe goes into the 1770s, but probably not much later than that. So we have an 18th century site, maybe goes into the American Revolution, is largely pre-Revolutionary War. And the yield of artifacts is very low. So what we've done, and you've seen this in other talks I've given, is once we've sampled that soil, try to look where the concentration is, where the site might be, we brought in machinery and we stripped away all the plowed soil. And it shows up really nicely here. I mean, these black bits are pieces of plastic sheeting that we've put down on the top of every post hole we found. And a look at this big pit feature here in the middle. That's close to 25 feet in diameter. So that's a pretty large archaeological feature. This is a map of what we had. And notice this line here. We'd found all these post holes forming a large, roughly 90 by 90 foot square, but hadn't exposed them all by the machine. We had to bring the machinery back and strip more soil to the east so we can get the entirety of this enclosure. Those, the circles there again represent shovel test pits. They're not particularly relevant at this point. But all these dark polygons with a number next to them, 1 over here, 2, 3, 4, etc. Those are all post holes. Now, typically when we find post holes, the first thing we think about is, oh, a house. You know, somebody's sticking posts in the ground, building a frame structure on top of it. But obviously at 90 foot by 90 foot, this is not a building. It's some sort of corral. And within that corral, we have 3 features. 40, the large circular one you saw when we stripped the site. Feature 41, which is about 6.5 by 5.5 feet. And then feature 42, which is around 10 feet by 6 feet, something like that. So 3 clear archaeological features, in addition to what is almost certainly a fencing or a corral, essentially, presumably to keep animals in. And I draw your attention to 2 of them over here. I don't know how well you could see me moving the cursor, but 14 and 15, these 2 posts are set very close together. This is almost certainly a gateway into this thing. And then we also have a 5th line of posts running something of an angle, 19 through 28. You know, what's going on there? Why is there another fence line within this corral? The answer is pretty clear. I don't know. But down here in this corner, we have a couple of extra post holes that probably were structural. I'll get back to them in a moment. Hello. There we go. So here's that feature 43, the long one in the upper right-hand corner. I think you can see it scored out. And you can see how it's a mixture of soils. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. You can see it's a mixture of soils that stand out against the undisturbed subsoil around it. You can see a post hole over here. Not only can you see the post hole, you can see the post mold off to the left. So large feature, it turned out to be about 1.5 feet deep. We only dug 1/4 of it. And you'd be amazed at what came out of there. Absolutely nothing. Not a single artifact. We have no idea what this hole in the ground is doing there. But the lack of artifacts is interesting. And here it is. So you could see it in plan view, along with associated fence posts going around it. And this is it at a different scale in section. It's just a big kind of trench, east wall. So that's east wall. I think that's this quadrant up here we excavated. Nothing in it. Feature 40, which is over on the west side of the site. Again, here's post holes 14 and 15. They are very close together. Most of these posts are on around 9.5 to 10.5 foot centers. That is, it's roughly 10 feet from the center of one post to the next. But with these 2, they're only like 3 or 4 feet. So it's pretty likely that this is some sort of gate coming in. And then you see this extra fence line coming up alongside of it. Feature 40, again, it was a pretty big feature, about 25 feet in diameter, as I recall, or about 20 feet. Not very deep, it was around a foot or so. It didn't produce a lot of material, but it did produce some artifacts. And interestingly enough, they were all over from the kind of the west side of the feature, closest to the gate. So it looks like somebody's coming in through the gate and dumping some trash in here. But the question is, why do we have this big pit in the middle of what appears to be a corral? Feature 40, you can see it's not very deep. We did a number of sections. We might have, I don't think we excavated in its entirety, but you can see it's not very deep. It's about 1.5 feet at most, more closer to 1 foot in most cases. These are just different sectional views of it. And it looks like largely one type of soil filling it in, probably material it's washed in. Again, down here in the southwestern corner, we have a couple of extra post holes that don't relate to the fence. The fence line is 28 through 35, and then we have 29 here and several post holes. These have burned daub in it, that is burned mud that was probably used to plaster a fireplace. So it suggests that we have a building there. Now, I'll get back to that. I've got these disorganized here. So it looks like we may have a building down in the southwest corner of this corral, just outside of it. Up in the northwest corner, we have feature 41, which is a pit, fairly straight-sided, about 6.5 by 5.5 feet. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it has several layers of soil in it. Two, stratum 2, I think particularly, is very rich. Lots of artifacts in it. A lot of bone is in it. The other thing that makes this feature interesting is that it cut through a post hole of mold. When we excavated this part of the feature, we could see the edge of that post hole. This square feature cut through an existing fence line. There are my features. This should have been the previous slide. But these are sectional views of the post holes that I think are structural in the southwest corner of the site. Notice, I mean, look at this one here, it's gone. These here, there's like 1/10 of a foot or 2/10 of a foot, a little bit of the post mold that survives, stratum 2 in each of these. These post holes, to hold up a wooden post of, let's say, 6 to 12 inches, those posts would have to be set into the ground at least 2 feet, maybe 3 feet. So these post holes should be, let's say, 3 feet deep. They are, in fact, 1/10 of a foot to 2/10 of a foot. That's how much soil has been lost on this site. Evidence of the building has largely been destroyed through erosion. Here's a view of, and then a shot excavating that first feature I talked about. Even this hole here goes down maybe 1.4 feet. Originally, it was probably 3 feet deep. So the upper portion of it has been lost. And that may be why we didn't find any artifacts in it. Back to feature 41, the 6.5 by 5.5 foot pit with lots of artifacts in it. You can just barely make out, here's the feature 19, the post hole and mold that it cut through. And you can see it's got some oyster shell on the top, mixed soils, it's not a uniform color. You could probably see little bits of reddened earth that, or in this case, probably brick. Oh, there's our post hole in red. So here it is in view. We've got this, it's right at the corner of the fence. We have that other fence line that was coming through at an angle. We have fence 19, fence post 19. So you can see it up here. This feature cut through an existing fence, this angular piece of fencing here. How that fence, that fifth line of post holes relates to the rest, I'm not entirely certain, but I suspect they were contemporary. I think folks came in through this gate here, 14 and 15, people or animals, and were routed around through here. I don't know. But it's certainly some sort of corral, almost certainly for animals. And then something happened afterwards with that feature 41. So here's another shot again. You know, it's excavated at this point, just 2 quadrants of this feature. And you can see the deposits aren't terribly deep. But again, they're quite rich. You could see some of the artifacts and oyster shell popping out of here. It looks like some sort of root cellar, which would suggest that there was a house on top of it. But we see no evidence of that house. Some of the material that came out of there, we've got stonewares, British brown. It's this large brown pieces up here, and probably this handle as well. Some more British stoneware here, some Westerwald stonewares that are very colorful. If you go down to Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg, you see this stuff all over the place. Mostly it's reproductions. But these are classic 18th century forms. And just as a comparison, this is, well, we look at, this would be the left, this would be the middle, this would be the right in this next slide. So this is the kinds of things that would have been at this site. Interestingly enough, all for beverages, drinking. And this is a really wonderful find here. It's a big rim. You can see the scale here is what? That's looks like it's about 4, it's in centimeters, but that's about 4 inches. This is the rim of a large earthen jar. And it would have been, the rim itself would have been some 8, probably about 12 inches in diameter. This was a big vessel. And it's of a type we call Iberian earthenware. For Iberia, that, you know, Spain and Portugal, that peninsula. We know a lot of this stuff was made in Iberia, but also made in Middle America by Spanish settlers. They're usually referred to as olive jars because that was one of the main things that were transported in these jars was olive oil, as well as olives and corn, all sorts of things. They're just sort of a general purpose storage vessel. And you can see here in the far left, this is probably something like what it had looked like. Huge. That's the late Audrey Noel Hume next to it. She worked down at Colonial Williamsburg with her husband, the late Ivor Noel Hume. But that's the kind of vessel. Here's another variant of it. And on the far right, in this famous painting by Velasquez, you can see this is one of these Iberian jars, and this one's entitled The Water Cellar. So this merchant here is selling water to passersby, and it's coming out of one of these large vessels. I used to live in Arizona. I lived in Tucson for a little over 2 years, and these things were called ollas, O-L-L-A, olla. And people often had them on their front steps for water. And the beauty of these things is they're unglazed, so the water gradually seeps through to the surface. And in an arid setting, that water on the surface evaporates. And that cools the contents, so you can have very nicely cooled water on the inside. But again, these things are used for storing also and shipping all sorts of things. The funny thing is, you find fairly big, you'll find a fairly big piece of Iberian earthenware at many colonial sites. And that's all you'll find. You'll find one piece. Where is the rest of the jar? We almost never find the rest of the jar. Why that is, I don't know. And of course, we find lots of tobacco pipes. These are often referred to as trade pipes. They're pretty typical 18th century form from the early through the middle 18th century. None of them, as I recall, have any maker's marks on them, so we can't date them more accurately. For those, some of you may be familiar with pipe stem dating, where we measure the bore of the pipe stem and look at that statistically. The smaller the bore, generally the later the pipe. But given the period we're dealing with here, pipe stem dating is not very useful. The various formulas we use don't work out. But they're 18th century. And buckles. Again, these are pretty common finds on mostly 18th century sites, a little bit in the late 17th, a little bit in the early 19th, but they're very common in the 18th century. Most of them are base metal, they're brass, but some could be or silver and or even gold, and are quite ornate and expensive. We know from paintings in museums from the 18th century that towards from the middle, the middle of the 18th century towards the end, buckles got bigger and bigger. It was a fashion statement. So people often wore these outrageously large buckles. The ones we've recovered, or fragments we've recovered from the site, are relatively small and modest. They're all base metal. That is some sort of copper alloy usually. No pewter, that I don't think any pewter. So again, these are probably more consistent with a mid-18th century occupation. And we found a bottle seal. And I provide an image of a bottle on the right-hand side just to give you an idea of how these things were used. Once the bottle was made, was still hot out of the furnace, the glass blower would, using a stamp, would create like a little medallion out of glass and then weld it onto the main body of the bottle. And this was a custom thing. When you ordered bottles from Europe, you'd say, well, I want certain kind of bottle of this particular size, and I want my monogram on it. And sometimes it's just the initials, sometimes it's a date. The one on the right is something like TB 1772, I think it says. But the one we recovered from the site just has IS and some sort of floral decoration in the middle. The I, you have to be very careful when you're dealing with the colonial period, and even into the early 19th century. Settlers often use the Latinate J, was an I. So the I, it's not really an I, it's a J. You see in the film about Indiana Jones and searching for the Lost Grail, he makes that mistake when he's sort of doing a hopscotch across this floor of stones that are marked with letters, and he forgets that an I in Latin is actually a J, so he almost falls through. So this is probably JS, and it's one of the reasons we think the site might have been the plantation site of James Skinner. Skinner was a very common name in Calvert County, and they were a fairly prolific and fairly high-profile family, well into the 19th century, I guess even today. We also found 1/2 of one Spanish silver coin. So this is a 2 reale piece. It has, I guess for the present purposes, the most important thing is what it looks like a 1 and a 9. On these Philip V of Spain 2 reale pieces, this is where the date would be. So this is almost certainly 1719. Minted in Madrid, because somewhere on here, and I can't remember quite where, is a capital M, and above that is capital R. So that's from Madrid. 1719. It was cut in half. If you look at it carefully, you can even see where somebody deliberately snipped this thing. And that was a common way of basically making change. You took your silver coin and cut it in half because its real value was based on the silver and not on the denomination that was printed on it or embossed on it. So we have an Iberian jar. We have a Spanish 2 reale coin. That suggests some sort of Spanish connection, you would think. But again, the jars were used for storage and transporting stuff all over across the Atlantic Ocean. And only one piece showed up. So this is probably just part of the trade item, and maybe not even a trade item, just an object used to ship some other material. Olive oil was very common in cooking in the colonial period in this region. And the coin, a good part of the circulating coinage, remember, there's no paper money in the colonial period until the Revolutionary War. It's all coin. Most of it is either is silver, and much of it is Spanish, for the simple reason that Spain had the monopoly on silver mines in Middle America. So they're producing huge amounts of silver, which they then mint into coins, and those coins are then used for commerce all around the world. Periodically, the General Assembly put out a bill, an index, sort of a chart that told people how much a silver Spanish 2 reale coin was worth in terms of English pounds sterling, and eventually Maryland pounds. So all these different currencies circulating at the same time. And this is true right up into the middle of the 19th century. It's only around 1850 or so that the US really starts producing, widely producing and circulating its own currency. So the fact that we find a Spanish coin on a site isn't all that remarkable. From the 2 pits, particularly from feature 41, the square one, we did get a fair amount of faunal material, remains of meals. A lot of these things are not exceptional. I mean, over in the far left-hand corner is just sort of a breakdown: bird, fish, mammal. Put turtle in there, but it's just like box turtle, probably not even eaten. But in terms of birds, we've got duck, what we call galliforms. I call it chicken-like. The modern chicken is the modern chicken. It's a relatively recent production of hybridization. But in the colonial period, there'd be also an assortment of yard fowl, which are essentially chicken-like. So we have chicken-like birds, and we have turkey. And I've never been able to distinguish wild turkey from domestic, so we don't know which this is. And I have the counts, which the pictures are. Yeah, so not many. We've got 15 bird bones that we can identify as the species. So not very many. In terms of fish, we have catfish, white perch, rockfish, and porgy. Total of 308 that we can identify as the species. There are a lot more fish bones there, but a lot of fish bones are not identifiable. So, and even white perch and rockfish, I've talked about faunal remains from colonial sites before. These 2 species are very similar. They're from the same genus. It's very difficult to distinguish them. Rockfish tend to be larger, but behaviorally they're different because white perch come up the streams into the interior of Calvert County. And so we're much more accessible. You don't have to travel several miles to the bay to go fishing for rockfish. White perch spawn up the creeks. And catfish are just classic, bottom feeders. You could find them in lots of waters in southern Maryland today, slow moving water with mucky bottoms. So that's the kind of fish they're eating. There are oysters at this site, but not a lot. There are relatively few oysters compared to those sites we find down on the coast or along major rivers like the Patuxent. In terms of mammal remains, pretty much what you'd expect: cow, deer, sheep, pig, and from hunting, gray squirrel, cottontail rabbit. We have 1 red fox. It's very possible that the fox is not a product of a meal, that the fox bone is from catching and skinning a fox. These folks did sell animal pelts. Or it could be that, there were chickens on this site. It could be a fox got in the chicken coop and was shot for his transgression. But you can look at the term in terms of numbers. 55 identified cow bones, 13 deer, which is a fair amount for a mid-18th century site. It looks like they're doing a bit of hunting at this site, more so perhaps than we've seen at some other earlier sites. 51 sheep, so we got a nice split between cow and sheep. But then pigs, 72. So pigs kind of the favorite. They're easy to raise. But these folks are raising sheep, which means they're not particularly afraid of wolves anymore. They've probably exterminated most of the wolves in the area. And it may be why they've got that 90-foot fenced enclosure. It may be that it was a sheepfold. Sheep need to be protected. Cows manage pretty well by themselves, and pigs, especially, not the pigs we have today, which are bloated, enormous things that can't get out of their own way. Pigs in the colonial period were fast runners, slim, tough, mean. They could take care of themselves. And that's how people used to raise them. They just let them run in the woods. An example of some of the fish bones recovered, and I think all of these are probably white perch and catfish. These dorsal spines here are definitely catfish. Some of the interesting things we found were in terms of plant remains. We've got on the left is corn, and on the right is wheat. Grains don't survive archaeologically unless they're either in a really saturated deposit, and we had nothing like that at this particular site. But you're digging in the bottom of a well, and it's been saturated for the last couple of centuries. Organic material like that could survive. At this site, we don't have those conditions, but what we're finding is material that had been burned, had been carbonized, and therefore it does survive. So corn and wheat, we're getting, two of the major grains used by these folks. And wheat's kind of interesting. We know everybody was growing corn. It was simple to grow. You fed it to livestock, you fed it to slaves, you fed it to indentured servants. You prepared it 10 different ways, all of which pretty much tasted the same. People were pretty sick of eating corn in any form. But wheat is important. Wheat is hard to grow, it's harder to process, but you do so to make, pretty much two things, bread and beer. And so when we find wheat on a site, it's kind of important. It suggests these are people who are not just getting by on pork, bits of pork and corn. They're actually got a more sophisticated diet, a more European diet. And we've got grape seeds. Interesting to know. I mean, they could be just wild grape. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, most of that stuff really comes out of Feature 41. It seems to be a trash deposit, rich in food remains, and a fair number of artifacts. Again, most of the material on this site has been washed away. So we don't necessarily have a representative sample of what was actually used on that site. So here's the site in general. Again, it looks like we've got the remains of a house down here, but it's been completely lost, virtually completely lost to erosion. We have what appears to be a root cellar up here, and it is later than the fence lines. This fence, this fifth fence at least, was here before this hole was dug, because this hole was dug and intruded through that one post hole. Beyond that, we don't really have anything in terms of how this plantation was laid out. We don't have remains of the houses. Even most of these fence post holes are not very deep. Come on. There we go. So here's one of these post holes. Not very large, couple feet long, 1.5 feet wide, a nice well-defined mold in the middle. These are just classic fence posts. So somebody dug a hole, dropped the post in the ground, backfill the hole, went on to the next. How these posts were linked, we don't know. Were they rail fences? Were they plank? They certainly weren't picket fences, because we'd see a little trench running between each the post molds to set the pickets in. My guess is it's some sort of split rail fence. And my guess again is that very likely that what we're looking at is a sheepfold. Jeez. But look at it once. This is a different one, same thing though. The mold is at one end. You can see the post mold here. But look how deep this thing is. It's like, you know, an inch. It's gone. And even if you take into account, when we stripped the site using machinery, we might have lost, and we were careful in doing this, but we could have lost 1/10 or 2 of a foot. But to put a post in the ground, expect it not to fall over, it's going to have to be, even a fence post is going to have to be at least 1.5 feet in the ground, and probably closer to 3 feet. So that was our job. We went in, we excavated this site. This Paula Mask here used to work with me, and Annetta Schott. Some of the neat things we found, showed to the local newspaper reporter, Joe Norris. So folks had in the area at least understood what had happened. There was nothing to see. Once we were done, we basically dug the site out of existence. But there's a technical report, and there's a newspaper piece, and that's about it. And so the site's gone, and most knowledge of it is gone too, unless we start doing more with it, websites, publication, that sort of thing. And we are working on that now. The only thing we have to compare to that site is actually directly across the road, going west across Route 24. A couple of years earlier, a firm called Dames and Moore excavated a site that was going to be developed and now is developed. But again, it had been heavily truncated by plowing and erosion. And unfortunately, the report is not very detailed. It's not clear what we have. I mean, clearly there's been a lot of erosion. There's certainly a fence line that runs through diagonally across the site. We have 2 of these features, feature 7 and feature 8, which look, see if we get the size of these things. Okay, it's 5 foot. Yeah, they're a little better than 5 foot long. So, I mean, in shape, they're a little bit like our feature 43 across the road. But as far as I know, they didn't produce much of anything. It's clearly an 18th century site, but there's just so little of it left because of erosion. Plowing and then erosion. So we don't really have anything to compare our site to in the immediate neighborhood. But that is what we're working on now. This is part of a larger study. I've talked about some of these sites before where we're focusing on diet. Abigail Kennedy from UMBC is working on the dietary component of this site, comparing it to an earlier site down at the tip of the county, but a different environmental setting. And eventually, I hope, there will be a book that takes in at least 8 of these sites and compares the kinds of food remains and artifacts we've recovered from each. Focus being on diet and the environmental impacts of those dietary choices. So that's all I've got for this evening. The one thing certainly what I want to point out is that we have an 18th century site, but our ability to learn something from that site has been greatly handicapped by another historical event, and that has been the development of commercial agriculture in southern Maryland, which, as a byproduct of that agriculture, we've lost not only archaeological sites, but the soils in which those archaeological sites were encased. So we've lost valuable agricultural land here because it's been eroded, and eroding has taken away what could have been a pretty important site. So anyway, that's all I've got for this evening. I'm open to questions if you have any.
How long were you on that site? I mean, how long did it take you to do the excavations?
I don't remember exactly, and I'd have to look it up, but I would say probably on the order of, if the different phases of work here, but something on the order of 6 weeks maybe. And we did it very efficiently too, in terms of how we mapped in features. And, we didn't grid out the whole site. We just mapped in individual features using an instrument. So we did things very cost effectively to get the maximum amount of data in the shortest period of time. Any other questions? One of the things that I've mentioned this before in previous talks, one of the, I think, outstanding findings of doing archaeology in Southern Maryland, apart from what we're learning about the past, the distant past, is we're learning about the effects of commercial agriculture on soils. The loss of soils in many places of Southern Maryland is absolutely tremendous. We've inadvertently remodeled the landscape. We've choked off creeks and springs where crops grew well at one time. Now, sometimes the best we can manage is hay. I think that's this part of the story of Southern Maryland that really needs to be told with more data.
How does that compare to Anne Arundel?
Anne Arundel sites generally, I find, have been better preserved, but that may be because of idiosyncrasies as to what sites get selected for excavation, what areas even get surveyed, where we might find sites. Calvert County is one of the worst because it's such a narrow county, and there's a ridge that runs down the center of it, which is pretty much occupied by Maryland 2-4. And the whole countryside is so heavily dissected. Fields tend to be very small and irregular with steep ravines. Erosion over the last couple of centuries has made that situation worse. But that situation has prevailed since Europeans arrived here. And so sites in Calvert County are going to tend to be more poorly preserved. That's true for big parts of Prince George's County, and it's certainly true for large parts of Charles County. What we need to do is bring together archaeological sites like this, and instead of just looking at, let's say, the colonial period, let's look at the 19th and 20th centuries and look at the effects of agriculture on these archaeological sites, because they tell us something very important about the history of agriculture in the state, particularly, well, really, from before the American Revolution. We saw it down Port Tobacco. The amount of erosion there, only in this case, it's soils deposited on top of the village site from uphill. But the amount of soil movement is just incredible. We just did a site in on property, Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, where we have maybe 8 grave shafts, just the very, very bottoms of them. No bones, not even nails. There's a colonial site associated with it, and there's virtually nothing left to the site. It's all eroded away. So there's an interesting story in agricultural history here, and there's a lot of archival. There's a lot of period references to it. Sometime after the Revolution, the Virginian patriot Patrick Henry is supposedly said, we've never been able to track down the reference, but it's widely cited. Patrick Henry said, "He is most patriotic who fills in the most gullies." So he's equating repairing the land, restoring its productivity, to a patriotic act. And because it's Patrick Henry, I don't remember when he died. I wasn't around at the time, and I haven't looked it up, but it's been a while. So he was observing that this process was going on. George Washington observed it going on. He had slave women going out and filling gullies during the winter, at the low part of the agricultural cycle. And it's really becomes outstanding after the Civil War. A large part of Maryland is depopulated. They're moving west because the soils are terrible. We have a Bureau of Immigration formed in 1890s to bring in immigrants from Eastern Europe and eventually from Western states to bring them back to this area. And they say, look, we have railroads, we have markets, we have all these institutions. It's a great place for farming, except the soil isn't so good because it's quote unquote exhausted, which means not only has it lost nutrition, it's lost soil through erosion. But there are efforts to get people to repopulate and recultivate Maryland because of the devastation to the soils that occurred over some 2.5 centuries. Interesting story, worth a book in and of itself. Any other questions?
We had a question in the chat from Patricia, and she asked, did you do any STPs downslope outside the site?
That's an interesting question because at Smithsonian, we did do that. And we found we had 3.5 feet of lenses of soil built up on top of an old plow zone. So the surface had raised in elevation nearly 4 feet over, we don't know how long, a century, 2 centuries. And we found that initially by doing shovel testing. This is a technique that we probably need to start using on these sites where you find the site, and the thing to do is figure out, well, which way was the soil likely going, and then doing some testing downhill to see if we can't recover evidence of the site above. So this is, as we learn from these sites, again, not just from the distant past, but from the agricultural past of the last century or two, we need to change our methods a little bit and start thinking about testing off-site. Thank you all for attending.